Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to the third in our series of breakfast webinars on regulatory risk and compliance in light of the COVID crisis. This morning we're doing something a little bit different. We're looking at the compliance challenge during and after the crisis, and I'm joined by a panel of experts who are going to take us through some of the issues that have arisen in their lives, professional lives, in context of the crisis. We have one speaker who hasn't yet dialed in, so you'll probably see another face pop up during the course of the webinar, and I'll introduce him as he pops in. So some preliminary remarks from me before I hand over to our first speaker, just on the context for this morning. So during the crisis, I think it's fair to say that regulated firms have had to stress test their compliance systems and processes under pretty dramatic and unprecedented circumstances posed by the crisis. They've had to ensure their systems and processes continue to provide them and their stakeholders with the necessary level of assurance, despite the disruption caused by the crisis in terms of, for example, access to personnel, premises, and records. Firms have had to adapt their compliance systems and processes to take account of pretty rapid changes introduced to regulatory standards and practices in order to deal with the crisis. So when firms reflect on the lessons learned by them from the crisis, and as they come to terms with its economic aftermath, what longer term learnings are there going to be around regulatory compliance? How well did traditional compliance models stand up to scrutiny? And are there changes which might need to be made to those models for the longer term in light of experience gained during the crisis? And those reflections should perhaps touch on the role of regulatory counsel and the wider legal team and their particular strengths and skills, and how those players fit within the broader governance and compliance structures within firms. Looking back at the crisis, how have firms made best use of their regulatory counsel, whether in-house or external, and is there scope to refine and improve their use of counsel in the broader compliance context? So those are some general thoughts from me to kick us off. What we're going to do is go to our panel of speakers to provide us with some preliminary thoughts from themselves, and then we'll move into a question and answer session. First speaker is Carolyn Lintz. Carolyn is a consultant with Shepherd and Wedderburn based in Singapore. Carolyn works with our clients in Southeast Asia, delivering legal support on regulation, markets and competition, including corporate governance. Carolyn is a chartered governance professional, and she's been lecturing in corporate governance in Asia since 2011, and more recently in the UK and the Middle East. She's a qualified chartered secretary and non-executive director. So Carolyn, I can turn to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Gordon. And could I ask you for the first slide, please, if you have it there? If not, don't worry, we'll carry on without it. Okay, so I'm going to go back a crisis here. My husband and I arrived in Singapore back at the end of August 2008. He had his new job. He was last in. I was going along as a trailing spouse, but I'd get a job, no bother at all. That's what everyone told me. 2 weeks later, Lehman Brothers collapsed. And I remember my husband calling me and saying that he was seeing things on the screen at work that he'd never ever seen before. Funnily enough, I started lecturing corporate governance not long after that. And as part of my lecturing, we actually looked at Lehman Brothers. We talk about it with the students, what went wrong. Lehman Brothers had a risk committee, but that committee only met twice. in 2006 and in 2007. 4 of the 10 board members were over 75 years old, and only 1 board member had current financial sector knowledge. So if any of you have read A Colossal Failure of Common Sense by Larry MacDonald, you will know that identification and management of risk was not a top priority at Lehman Brothers. But one of the things that did come out of the global financial crisis of 2008, it drew attention to the need for boards to recognise the significance of risk and their responsibility for risk assessment and management. Gordon, could I have the second slide, please? Okay, thank you. So this is a very, very important role. The 2 reports that I have mentioned here on the screen looked at 40 corporate crises. And what the authors were trying to do was identify the root cause of failure in each of these cases. And there were 3 major causes of failure identified in over 40% of the cases tracked. Just look at number 2 on the screen, the board's inability to engage with important risks, such as risks to reputation, license to operate, and working assumptions. Okay. This isn't an easy role. In a pre-COVID-19 BDO survey, immediately before COVID-19, directors said that regulatory compliance and effective risk oversight prioritization were 2 of the top challenges for their board. And we've all seen many examples of where it's gone wrong. A very recent one, for example, was Carillion. And if you look at the parliamentary report in May 2018 and listen to what they say, the parliamentary committee did not miss. When talking about the board, they say that the truth is that in acquisitions, debt, and international expansion, Carillion became increasingly reckless in the pursuit of growth. In doing so, it had scant regard of long-term sustainability or the impact on employees, pensioners, and suppliers. So, as always with crisis, as we're seeing now, comes reviews. And on the back of Carillion, we've had Sir John Kingsman's review of the FRC, the Financial Reporting Council, calling for a new regulatory body. We've also had Sir Donald Brydon's review into the quality and effectiveness of audit, which means yet again more change. And with reviews always come these changes. Gordon, could I have the next slide, please? So here we have the 3 lines of defence model. Now, there are many, many tools out there to help with risk management and risk assessment. Possibly the best known one is the 3 lines of defence model. And just to recap, for anyone who's not terribly familiar with the model, that first line of defence is management and internal control measures. And they have primary responsibility. That is where primary responsibility sits in this model. The second line of defence is support functions such as risk and compliance. And internal audit is that 3rd line of defence. Now, this model itself is undergoing change. This was pre-COVID, but the IIA, the Institute of Auditors, had identified the model as needing worked on. And at the heart of the matter was the broadening of the scope of that model beyond value protection, that defence model, to embracing value creation. And hopefully, and we will be in touch with you to let you know about this, we can hear more from the IIA about their new model. We're supposed to be hearing about this later this year. But with COVID, we don't know that that's definitely going to happen, but we will keep you posted. So currently we have COVID-19. And Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance very recently said that the pandemic has shown that effective risk management needs to be dynamic, it needs to be forward-looking, it needs to be comprehensive, and it needs to be nimble. At the moment, ICSA, who I do my CPD, my continuing professional development with, are running a number of seminars around risk. And I sat in one very recently called How Proactive Governance Reduces Reactive Compliance. And at the end of that webinar, we were given a checklist. And on the checklist, it said team members must have access to appropriate intelligence tools to stay abreast of new laws and regulatory updates in relevant industries and jurisdictions. Okay, so it's all about, a lot of this is about getting as much information as possible, as quickly as possible. So in summary, what I have seen over the years I have been lecturing corporate governance is a huge pace of change in terms of laws and regulatory requirements, which often come about in response to crisis, as we're seeing now. We're seeing much more shareholder activism. Investors are very interested now in how risks are being managed by their investee companies. We're seeing companies having to engage with their stakeholders much more. I see this as part of their license to operate. We've seen this highlighted during the crisis. So, for example, the CEO at Schroders, after a bit of negative publicity, gave away his bonus to charity. We saw it with Sports Direct, who opened up their shops when they shouldn't have, claiming that they were essential services. So you can see the pushback from stakeholders when this kind of things happen, which becomes a reputational issue for corporates. We also don't know how businesses are going to emerge from this crisis. Once the furlough scheme, and we have a similar scheme here in Singapore, once that has come to an end, we don't know what companies, I beg your pardon, are going to have in terms of resources, financial and people. So what this means to me is that I think we're going to see a lot more outsourcing of services, if that is permitted. I think what companies are going to want is all that knowledge that was talked about in that checklist. And I think they're going to want to have their trusted advisors there to give it to them. And I don't believe that we'll see as many people wanting the full-time employees on their books, but I'm very interested to hear what the other panel members have to say about that. And Gordon, if you could just put on the last slide, please. And here I have just, to help out, the last two slides are basically questions that boards should be asking at the moment. Gordon talked about stress testing your systems. Well, here are a list of questions straight out the very interesting Governance and Compliance magazine of things that boards should be discussing in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Lots of food for thought there, and in fact, your remark about shareholder activism chimes actually with what was discussed in our last webinar about rethinking regulatory priorities after the crisis, and the role of investors, critical role of investors in guiding thinking around regulation and regulatory priorities. I think the same can be said about compliance and governance as well. So with that, I'll now move on to our second speaker. Incidentally, I see our missing speaker, Matt, has been able to dial in, so I am pleased to see his face. But first of all, I will hand over to Michael Davis. Michael is a legal director from Scottish Power. He is a Scottish qualified lawyer with a wealth of in-house and private practice experience predominantly in the energy sector. He advises on a range of corporate legal risk, regulatory compliance matters across a diverse range of stakeholders at Scottish Power. He's also, as if that wasn't enough, trustee of the Scottish Power Group pension scheme, which will be an interesting role these days. So, Mike, if I could hand over to you for your remarks.
Thanks, Gordon, and good morning to everyone who's joined this morning's webinar. My aim for the next couple of minutes is to just give a short industry perspective on compliance and its interaction with the challenges posed by coronavirus. And hopefully you'll find that both interesting and useful. But before turning to the slide, Gordon, as a general comment, coronavirus has obviously clearly had a massive and dramatic effect on people, business, and our general way of life, and has destabilized economies and reminded us about things that truly matter. And it's also driven through rapid change, which would have taken years to have achieved in normal circumstances. And it's fair to say I think society has been rocked by this and presents us with a unique set of challenges, not least from a compliance perspective. Now, turning to the slide, Gordon, if you can put that up on screen.
Yeah. Give me a second.
Yeah, I've laid out on the slide 6 areas that I plan to cover, ranging from governance, policy, process, reporting, resources, compliance and assurance, measures and benefits and learnings from what we've learned so far from dealing with the coronavirus. So taking each of these in turn, in terms of governance, I think the importance of maintaining a continued functioning and effective corporate governance system and the core values and principles that underpin that are integral to any company's compliance model. In addition, I think it's also important to ensure companies' constitutional frameworks can support what I call the new business normal, which essentially looks at things like facilitating shareholder meetings, but in the new world. So we're seeing companies holding virtual shareholders meetings if their constitutions permit, and also other equivalent forms of meetings. And linking into one of the points that Carolyn said earlier, ensuring the board is well informed on key issues is really important to enable it to properly perform and discharge their duties. And with that, also dealing with a crisis such as coronavirus, it's important to have a strong governance framework around kind of business continuity management and organisation. Certainly with Scottish Power, we have a command structure that's been set up to both cover drawing together the cross-sectoral expertise of key executives and also operational senior management, so that there's a clear line of communication and reporting to deal with the kind of constantly evolving issues that are arising out of the challenges that are posed by the coronavirus. In terms of policy, process and reporting, companies have had to adapt these areas in a relatively short space of time to allow them to bend or flex to the current crisis that we find ourselves in. And this probably takes the form both of a mix of new bespoke policies and also adaptations to existing policies. Typically, this sort of process would probably take a kind of prolonged period of time over a series of reviews and proper consideration. However, in the current climate that we work in, we just don't have that time, and certainly the pace of change, where changes are happening all the time with regards to whether it's guidance coming from government or legislation or regulation. These policies are having to be put under, as Gordon used the word, stress tested, and see if they need to be updated or amended in accordance to keep pace with the constantly changing environment. But that said, as well as changing or adapting these policies or creating new policies, there need to be appropriate safeguards and controls in place. Just because there's an emergency situation, safeguards and controls can't be overlooked either. And linking back to kind of one of the comments I said at the beginning, tailored reporting to the board is really important, and also to senior management. Therefore, you're kind of having bespoke new forms of reporting, covering off specific issues around coronavirus it was also a key element here. In terms of resources, companies are obviously having to adapt to their new business as usual norms, and resources and how they're deployed are critical here. Connectivity and communication of leadership, I think, is imperative, especially with the challenges posed by remote working and operating in remote environments. I think that's, the communication and connectivity has become pivotal to that. And to be able to do that, obviously everyone needs to have the right equipment and have that deployed across not just the senior leadership, but to the entire working population that requires the right necessary tools to do the job. And with that, IT systems, technology resilience need to be kept up with pace as well. And at the same time, employee well-being can't be overlooked either. So the mental and the physical health side of this, you need to make sure that you've got a healthy workforce to ensure that they know what's happening, how they fit into the company's plans with regards to how it's dealing with coronavirus, and also working in new and innovative and collaborative ways, and again using technology as a tool and a friend, and certainly being used to levels that haven't probably been seen before, in terms of whether it's using online collaborative tools like Microsoft Teams or Skype or Zoom or Workcast for the purpose of today's session. I think our reliance on technology and using it to such a greater extent and in more depth is definitely something for now and the future. In terms of compliance and assurance, I think coronavirus obviously presents some new challenges for companies, whether that's ranging from keeping abreast of the fast-paced and evolving legislation and regulation and guidance that's coming out, through to making sure that the business understands how those new regulations relate to them, and to ensure the ongoing and continuing compliance with those changing regulations. But at the same time, maintaining a strong culture of integrity and compliance with heightened compliance monitoring, because obviously with relaxation or flexing of standards or rules by regulatory bodies or the government can also lead, for those who want to be opportunistic about it, to look at ways to commit fraud or bribery or misconduct. So there needs to be a really heightened compliance monitoring process underway as well. And at the same time, things like data and cyber vigilance are also important. We've seen a number of cases in the UK since the coronavirus outbreak has happened, where cyber criminals have taken advantage of the situation for their own ends. So it's really important for companies to keep that at the forefront of their mind as well. I think it also presents challenges for regulators. Obviously, I'm talking from a company perspective, but I think the regulators have also had to look at how they approach their roles and responsibilities. And I think we've seen instances of the need for regulatory flexibility, in particular the interplay between the application of what would probably be traditional regulatory routes through either primary or secondary legislation for particular issues, and moving to an alternative method where they've had to issue guidance or guidelines or communications. Again, due to the pace of change that's happening here, they haven't been able to follow traditional methods in all circumstances. So again, that's a key. In terms of obviously talking from our perspective, there's been a range of measures that have had to be deployed to mitigate the compliance challenges. And I think these can be categorized from an internal perspective and an external perspective. Internal being those relating to the employees and operations. For example, making sure business continuity matters are constantly being kept under review and issues being dealt with as and when they come up. Enhanced IT functionality, safety and well-being of both critical and non-critical employees, making sure that, obviously for Scottish Power being an essential service provider, it needs to allow its critical staff to still move around and operate to essentially keep the lights on. So there's a role there for the company to ensure that we can ensure our employees are adequately equipped to do their job. Monitoring supply chains to identify early shortages and gaps in supply chains, and also ensuring that appropriate contractual relevant protections are deployed and monitored as and when are needed, and updating policies and procedures, which obviously we've touched upon earlier. And from an external perspective, protecting power supplies to critical facilities, providing customers with financial flexibility and support, maintaining business and operational continuity, and also supporting our communities and assisting with the wider efforts, such as donating PPE to the NHS and so forth. And then finally, turning to the final section on the slide, the benefits and learnings, I think probably one of the key takeaways from my perspective is regulatory compliance in the coronavirus era has had to flex. It's had to respond and recalibrate to the unique set of circumstances that have required, an element of proportionate flexibility. And we've seen numerous examples of this in the energy sector, both from Ofgem and also from the government, in terms of the way they've approached setting out certain priorities for companies to have to follow, whilst at the same time, relaxing any sort of enforcement action they may take for activities that are more of a lower priority or deprioritized as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. And then finally, in terms of benefits, I think there's a couple here. Coronavirus has been a key driver for faster change. And I think it's important that momentum shouldn't be lost and should be embraced and taken forward. I think corporate norms have been challenged and changed probably permanently in some situations. And it would be important to see how those new situations bed in a post coronavirus world. And I think also presents an opportunity to, when everyone is returning back to what will be the new normal, building back in a different and better way. I think it presents an opportunity for companies, from whether it's a governance perspective or whether it's a compliance perspective. There's a real opportunity here to rebuild back in a better and more effective way, maximizing opportunities to improve protocols, embracing technology, and evolving for the future. So I think, just to conclude, clearly coronavirus has had a massive and dramatic effect from a compliance point of view. I think it's presented us with a unique set of challenges. That said, and obviously linking back to a point that Carolyn made earlier, we've faced crises in the past, and we're likely to face more in the future. And whilst restrictions are being slowly lifted and the foundations being laid for what will be the new normal, I think it will be interesting to see how ultimately what this will mean for business and for compliance. I think a key challenge for compliance leaders will be to take the opportunity to overcome these new challenges posed, help ensure standards are upheld, and proactively seek opportunities to improve those processes and operations moving forward, and also to embrace technology and innovation in an agile and effective manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Really helpful insight. Now I'm going to move quickly over to Matt Peacock, who is our next speaker. Matt is the managing partner of OMC Partners, which is a management consultancy founded in 2006. And he works with major GC and top UK international law firms, helping teams develop and deliver legal risk and compliance strategies and enhance their operations. Prior to OMC, Matt was a regulatory litigator with a top 15 law firm. So Matt, if I could hand over to you, if you can hear me.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I'm going to turn my video off to help improve the feed. So just bear with me. So fingers crossed you can see the slide deck, Gordon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Grand. Okay. So just prior to coronavirus really taking hold, we interviewed a range of general counsel, heads of compliance and risk on behalf of Shep Wed, and asked them about the challenges that they were facing in managing their global compliance and monitoring global regulation. You can see on the slide a makeup of the participants, but they were all facing one very common challenge, which was, as one person described it, this growing tsunami of legislation. And you can get a sense of the scale of the problem facing most organisations here. One point worth noting, this is pre-coronavirus estimate, but we were expecting the volume of regulation to increase by about 40% in the next 5 years. And my money is on that being something of an underestimate now. But in any event, faced with this growth, how are organisations balancing their budgets with this increasing compliance burden? And that was the question really we asked of these participants. So what you're about to see is an extract of the white paper. It's only part of it, and the findings relate specifically to budget and balancing budget with this burden. I'm sure if you want a copy of the white paper, Gordon can share that with you after this event. Surprise, surprise, budget is always the problem, but specifically there are three elements to it that we identified. One was the ownership of the budget, so it's not always clear who is holding the purse strings. It could be split across the General Counsel's team, regulatory affairs, compliance, risk. Alternatively, it could be split by business line or geography. Another challenge was, as participants told us, how do you obtain budget? And the answer, frankly, is you need that compelling business case, which is sometimes hard to build. And the final challenge that we identified was, how do you balance your budget with resourcing? So in a landscape where there's very little really by way of technology to help automate compliance and regulatory monitoring, most organizations have to throw human resource at the solution. And frankly, the bums on seats approach to monitoring and compliance can frequently be expensive. So we found as a result that organizations were balancing their budget by blending resources, both their own but also their law firms, and often, if available, supplementing that with sector-specific technology solutions. So particularly in highly regulated areas like telco, pharma, there were compliance products aimed at that sector that they could tap into. But what we also identified, and this will come no surprise, I suspect, to the audience here, but they also considered proportionality in terms of how they focused their investment and their effort. And we pulled a model together which really distills what these organizations were saying to us. But essentially, they were applying several layers of thinking to help them focus their budget, their effort, and their resource. So starting at the very top layer, organizations were looking at the type of regulation that they were monitoring. And at the highest priority end, they were looking at things that were absolutely business critical. So as an example, if you were a tobacco company, clearly tobacco packaging regulation was key. If you're a telco, various telco regulation. There was then the next level of priority, which was what we've called here those things of a global concern. So all the usual suspects: data protection, cybersecurity, anti-bribery and corruption, and so forth. And then the third tier was I guess more day-to-day operational measures. So your health, safety, environment, and so forth. So that was the layer one where organizations were starting. They then looked at the territories where that regulation impacted, and again prioritizing their effort. So at one end they had areas that were of strategic importance, whether that was because of a stock exchange listing or large employee footprints or just a key market from a business perspective. But a slightly separate bucket was was what we've called here the problem territories. So they may not be of a strategic importance, but they cause headaches. And the example here being anti-bribery and corruption in, for instance, Nigeria, China, Brazil, Russia. And I guess if you then had a third pot, which was not strategically important nor a problem, it fell in between, and organisations would therefore take a lighter approach, a lighter touch to how they were assessing and monitoring risk in those territories. And the final layer that we identified, which again, no surprises, is a quantum. So what was the cost of getting something wrong? One participant, for instance, used a de minimis of €5 million. So everything below that just fell off the radar. But using this type of approach, this type of methodology, these organisations were allocating budget, effort and resource to monitoring regulations and then implementing measures in these high priority areas. And then along came coronavirus. And frankly, what we've seen since is that it's hit the pause button in some areas of compliance, but amplified others. And my view, and what I hear from GC I speak to, is that it's this top layer, the type of regulation where the focus has shifted more towards the operational day-to-day affairs, so health, safety, human resource measures, which has had with limited and finite resources, an impact on some of those formerly higher priority areas. And I think that has been reinforced by regulators accepting the realities of enforcement on a practical level, which means that some areas of regulation have quite simply sort of fallen down the priority list in terms of how organisations invest their budgets. I think that the territory layer that I mentioned has largely remained unchanged, although I think really interesting that if you look at the problem territories, 4 are listed there in terms of anti-bribery and corruption, but in the last couple of months we've seen problems with China, Brazil and Russia all under-reporting coronavirus statistics, all having slightly confusing and inconsistent regulation in terms of how to deal with that. And I think going forward, we'll see that the usual suspects causing organisations headaches. And I think to cap off on this slide, I think the quantum layer is still there to an extent, albeit I think the cost element has morphed somewhat from a financial cost into a human cost or a people protection cost. So again, we asked GC, and this is before coronavirus, what their needs and demands were like for the next 2 years, what they saw of the landscape at that time in terms of compliance and monitoring regulations. And this is what they told us, and I'm sure Gordon can share the slides afterwards. But notably here, we're looking at this desire for improved budget management. So budgets being brought under a single roof, and usually an empowered GC with the ability to then determine where to invest that. I think since coronavirus has taken hold, the chat that I'm hearing is that compliance functions, general counsel are concerned that at this really heightened time with even more regulation on the horizon, that there'll be this continuous squeeze on their budgets, and they are frankly looking at how they can, in the short term at least, balance those priorities. I think if we look at some of the other headings here, my view is that coronavirus has really amplified some of these demands going forward. So as an example, with fewer physical boots on the ground, with fewer people out there at the coalface in these various territories, there's even greater emphasis now on data management and enhanced reporting to really help with these disparate working practices, particularly as as more people are working from home. So you'll be pleased to hear, just to wrap up and conclude, but budgets, surprise, surprise, still very much under pressure. Those who are responsible for compliance and hold the purse strings are pivoting their effort, budget and resource to accommodate these new coronavirus operational priorities. I think regulators are already being flexible in terms of how they enforce regulation, and words like empathetic, pragmatic, proportionate all abound at the moment. But I think my view is that as we emerge, we'll see a rebalancing of these priorities towards a more business as usual landscape. And I think that means reverting back to the former of those two red, amber, green slides rather than the latter. But that might be a famous last word. So happy to hand back now. I'll stop sharing, Gordon.
Thanks, Matt. What I'd like to do now is begin our discussion, and I'd like to begin that with our fourth presenter. Well, in the presentation, I thought it'd be useful to pick up the first of the sort of discussion points with Sarah Leslie, who joins us, English Shepherd and Wedderburn. A person who is an employment specialist, and she regularly deals with HR aspects of regulated firms. One of the specific areas of expertise that she has is around the financial services sector and the senior managers regime that those of you who work in that sector will know and no doubt love. Sarah, I wonder just to open up the conversation, picking up on the point that Matt was making about the sort of the people challenges that regulated firms have had to grapple with. Whether there's thinking about the lessons that we're learning from the crisis, whether there are any particular aspects of the learnings for how to be effective in a compliance setting that you might want to comment on particularly from a people perspective.
So thanks, Gordon. I think I anticipate most of us listening today have probably found that with remote working systems in place, the move to doing office work from a remote setting has been pretty seamless, at least in companies which had already provided laptops to employees. I think particularly for those of us with children, you can imagine once the children go back to school that might be even easier. In terms of regulatory compliance, one of the things that we've seen with COVID is that there's been quite a lot of ease of adaptation in many settings once there's been the original assessment for the first few weeks and months of what exactly the implications have been and are going to be. The regulators have been, in most cases, quite able to respond to that and adapt. And the issue has been getting employees secure in the home environment, and then just the ability to roll out training that keeps on top of any changes that the regulators have made. What we have seen, one particular aspect of compliance that we've been helping clients deal with has been the FCA's approach to the senior manager and certification regime that you'd referred to there in the introduction, Gordon, which was introduced for banks by the FCA and the PRA after the 2008 financial crash and extended to asset managers and insurance over the past few years. And one of the main principles behind that regulatory system was to increase accountability and to actually change the culture of the business, and to ensure that senior managers are fully responsible for ensuring the areas they've been designated as responsible for are operating correctly in accordance with principles of good governance. So from a people perspective, when things go remote, again, just the importance of good management lines becomes really clear, of managers checking in with their teams and just having that clear line of, I'm responsible for this, I'm delegating it to you, and checking up with then the compliance function coming behind that, and being able to operate, as Caroline was mentioning, as a second line of defence, whether or not it's as clearly demarcated as that.
Yeah. I wonder, thank you, I wonder, coming to Mike, for example, thinking about the people aspects of the challenge, which you touched on in your earlier slide, and what Matt was saying about the pivot towards the operational priorities, almost to the exclusion of other things. How thinking about your own experience of having to huddle round in that way, what are your reflections on how that's been, and whether anything that Matt has said, or Sarah, for example, has kind of resonated with you?
Yeah, I think, everyone's had to react to coronavirus, and they've had to reprioritise their activities, whether that's from a compliance perspective or from a policy perspective. And I think, whilst that's probably necessary in the current climate, there needs to also be the kind of controls in place in the background there to make sure that if these things are being changed, at some point we are going to revert back to some sort of new normal, whatever that looks like. And we need to be able to then kind of justify why we've made these changes and the way we've made these changes, and appropriately documented and rational thought process there why we've gone through that. And I think that's a kind of key point here around the kind of the people bit, and flexing that for the short term at least, to get us through the crisis. And then kind of Matt made the point about, there'll be some degree of reversion back to a kind of position of normality pre-COVID, but how that will look, I guess none of us probably truly know yet, and because we're still in the midst of it all.
Yeah, and Caroline, looking at what Matt was laying out in terms of like a pre-COVID and COVID impact approach, I'm interested in your view as a corporate governance sort of advisor, what your take on that sort of shock that's been sustained to I feel like compliance culture within organisations, and how that's going to recover, whether it's going to, as Matt put it, come back to business as usual, or perhaps not. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, Matt's been speaking to people, so I that's fine. I don't know if we can go back to business as usual. I mean, I suppose my view of this is that risk can come from anywhere, and I'd be really interested to know, and Matt, maybe you've got a take on this, how many companies actually identified this pandemic as a risk, and were prepared to deal with it, and this was one of the points that we've been talking about earlier. Assuming that this started in Wuhan, in a marketplace, with whatever people were eating, how many companies can actually would have taken that into account, would have built it in as a risk, and would have gone through the scenario planning that we often do to work out what the response would be. So I think that for me is the thing that will have to change. I think for me the big thing is risk can come from anywhere, but I just wonder if Matt has any views on how companies, did they see this coming? Were they planning for it? How have they dealt with it?
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah. Great Great question. Happy to jump in if I'm not on mute. No, I'm not. The simple answer is there are some leading companies who did identify a pandemic and had measures in place to respond to it, not from a specific, we know this is going to be a coronavirus event, but that I've been told that some have been tracking these things since the mid-1990s. So it has factored in some organisations' responses. Having said that, I think it's fair to say the majority may not have seen this specifically coming along, but many have planned for analogous events from a sort of business continuity perspective, whereby they've been able to, perhaps this is a bit flippant, but take the playbook off the shelf, dust it down and tweak it to fit this current scenario. But you're right. I think, as ever, there's a spectrum of people. There are people who were well prepared. There were people who weren't prepared at all. And most people probably fall in the middle of that somewhere.
Yeah. The thought that strikes me in what the exchange between yourselves is, I guess, one can't actually predict what the black swan or whatever is going to manifest itself, but having a culture or a governance structure or whatever that's resilient enough or responsive enough to be able to take those things on board is perhaps the key, because the particular risk isn't actually one that you can predict. It's how, as an organisation, you are prepared to respond to, react to, manage anything that might impact your organisation is perhaps the key thing. Mike, do you have that sort of sense, or a different take on that?
No, I think that's right. I think certainly from the perspective I'm talking from, it was there as a risk. It was an identified area that business continuity would need to kick in and support in that sort of eventuality, and there were plans in place that were then implemented. I think what will be interesting in the new normal, whatever that looks like, is what people do with their, to pick up Matt's point about compliance playbooks, whether they will evolve now and look like something quite different in the future, and how they'll look different and how they're able to respond to, because at this point it's very hard to predict every single type of eventuality and the likelihood of it. But yeah, I think compliance playbooks will probably be an area where people may look at them again and say, are these fit for purpose? Is it kind of just a tweaking exercise, or actually do we need something a bit more focused?
Yeah, and I guess also there's that tendency that we all have once we've experienced something like this, whether perhaps not as dramatic as this, but we were going through a crisis, to sort of want to move on and to sort of get back to normal and not spend the time assessing what happened and doing that review. Caroline, is that something that's a sort of a natural reaction that we must sort of try and compensate against or tackle?
Yes, I think so. I mean, one of the things that they teach managers over the years is that they should be doing self-reflection to look at what went wrong and then to help themselves correct things. And I think it's really important that we do this. I mean, you were talking about stress testing. What worked? What didn't? What do we now need to change? And it's being proactive. I mean, coming back to that webinar that I mentioned earlier, proactive governance is what's needed. And not that, if we can avoid it, that slipping back to, oh, well, that was what we had before. It was kind of okay and we know it and we're comfortable with it. Is what can we do positively now to bring about change, giving the lessons that we've learned over the period? And I think for me, one of the most important things that's come out of all of this is the amount of information I believe that people will need will just be increasing hugely. They're going to need all the right information from trusted advisors or internally, whichever way you do it, doesn't really matter, but you need all this information to be making informed decisions. So self-reflection and more information, more relevant information are, to me, two key things.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if I could come to Matt. I mean, the point about information and data, we all in our lives have had to find ways of managing, coping with data, and the data sort of cascade. Looking at one of the aspects of the crisis that's been talked about is the data is, we don't have it. We're working in an uncertain environment. Things are changing from day to day. Are there any thoughts that you have about looking at the in-house function, whether it be the GC function, compliance function, just handling uncertainty and what one does with uncertainty, and without being paralysed by uncertainty? What organisational sort of lessons you've seen people learn or try to promote around dealing with uncertainty?
I think two points strike me. One is I think there's greater awareness that you can learn from your peers. I think we're all in this together, and what one peer learns may be of benefit to others. And I think sharing best practice, sharing approaches, techniques will only increase, even if that's amongst a peer sector. So whilst we were interviewing people for the white paper, it was very obvious that there were some sectors like oil and gas where actually there was quite a lot of collaboration going on. I suspect there will be more of that. But at the other side of things, there were like the tobacco companies who wouldn't talk to one another if their lives depended on it. Maybe that might change now. I think the other nuance is that really, as a compliance sector, if I could call it that, we don't really attract the investment that's needed in monitoring technologies. I suspect there will be a good hard look at that now as compliance functions, general counsel decide as a result of this that they need to digitize more. And I think that ability to manage larger and growing volumes of data, we've hit that tipping point now where you simply can't do that with the bums on seats approach I described. You must have some technology to be able to collate, condense, and then prioritize that data.
Yeah, that sounds the right direction of travel. I wonder if in the closing sort of minutes now, I can come back round to colleagues just for a little bit of a reflect on their key takeaways from the crisis in terms of effective compliance or how we do compliance. Just to leave us with those thoughts, and maybe go back in the order that we began, and perhaps start with Carolyn.
Hi. Well, I come back to the Harvard Law School's quote, which is effective risk management needs to be dynamic, forward-looking, which is what we're trying to do with the 3 lines of defence model. It needs to be comprehensive and it needs to be nimble. And I think all these things are really important. How that's going to look, though, when everyone gets back, when furlough stops, I think Matt's right. I think we're going to be looking at IT now to help us in terms of all that information, collating it, prioritising it. I think we have to, because it just seems there's more and more information out there, and I think there's no substitute as well. I have to say this because I've been watching and sitting in on all the S&W webinars on COVID-19. The trusted advisor really helps. And I've listened to everyone talk about all the clients that they've worked with. And really what you're talking about is not a hand-holding exercise, but it's that reassurance, that comfort that when you need the right information, it's there. And that helps a lot.
Thanks, Caroline. Mike, closing thoughts from yourself.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what Caroline said there. I think compliance renewal needs to be kind of dynamic and agile to be able to respond quickly to situations like coronavirus in the future. And I think technology and innovation is going to be key in that, because I think the volumes of information that boards would require, or management teams, or crisis management teams will need. They need a lot of that information to make informed decisions, but with the right information to hand, and in a way that is intelligible for them to be able to cut through detail and get to the key salient points. So I think technology and innovation are going to be key to all of that. And in terms of the new landscape, when we go back to the new normal, I think it'll be interesting to see how that beds in. And I think it could just go one of the points I made earlier. I think there's also an opportunity for companies to kind of just build themselves back up in a better way as well. Take the opportunity of coronavirus to be a catalyst for change in the right proportions and context.
Thank you, Mike. Matt.
Yeah, I think very pithily, the risk landscape isn't static, and it can change, and it can change quickly. So I think compliance risk GC functions, this is the opportunity to build in that agility and that flexibility. And I think we'll also see the greater emphasis of technology as an enabler to that.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And finally, Sarah, any closing remarks from yourself?
Yeah, so I'm aware of time, so just very quickly, but I think it's important in all of it just to keep that people and culture aspect in mind, so that internally management are hearing about any potential issues that might come up, particularly in the remote working environment, when it can be harder to hear what's actually happening on the ground. And that also feeds in a bit to whistleblowing, that people are actually aware of procedures in place and feel comfortable speaking up if they have any concerns.
Thank you. Okay, well, that's been an excellent conversation. We've crammed a lot of material in there. People will be able to play it back at their leisure in the recording when we circulate that, so that you can enjoy the exchanges. And as has been mentioned, we'll circulate details of today's event to delegates. So with that, all that remains for me is to thank very much for colleagues who've joined the presentation and discussion today, and bid you all good morning. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.